"Who is he, Mommy? Why are you crying?" Twins' question shattered a billionaire. Her voice trembled as she whispered through her tears. "You just denied your own blood, and you don't even know it." In that glittering ballroom, beneath crystal chandeliers and flashing cameras, Grace Miller's world collapsed in a single moment. She had come to share the secret of new life, but instead watched the man she loved, billionaire Daniel Carter, stand proudly beside another woman who claimed his child. Heartbreak and humiliation burned through her like fire. What would you have done in his place? Welcome to Emotional Echoes, a channel where emotions come alive and every story leaves a lasting echo in your heart. Please subscribe to Emotional Echoes channel. Help us reach 1,000 subscribers so more souls can feel these stories. Stay with my video till the very end and let me know where you're watching from so I can see how far this story spreads. Now, let me tell you what really happened that night. Daniel Carter was 36, already a name that carried weight across every corner of American media. He was the kind of man who walked into a room and bent it to his will, the kind of man whose smile was calculated for cameras. Grace Miller, 27, watched him from the crowd that night with her heart pounding. She was not dressed in diamonds or silk, but in a modest gown she had saved for months to buy. Hidden in her chest was a secret she had rehearsed 100 times. Tonight she would tell him he was going to be a father. She held a champagne glass she never touched, her eyes fixed on him as he stepped up to the microphone. Grace expected the warmth he sometimes showed her in private, a glance that might say she belonged, but his gaze never searched for her. Instead, his eyes swept over the audience like she was no one, like she was invisible in the sea of glittering faces. The smile he wore was polished, detached, the smile of a man performing a role. Then he called a name that was not hers. Clara Whitmore glided across the stage, perfect in her designer dress, her hand curling around Daniel's arm, as if she had always owned it. The applause erupted, blinding and cruel. Grace stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat. When Clara announced that she was carrying Daniel's child, the room gasped, as if history had been made. Grace felt the world tilt, the floor sliding out from under her, as though she had been erased in an instant. Her chest ached, with the secret still trapped inside her. She had pictured this moment so differently, imagined his face softening at the words she carried. Instead, she saw a man lifting his chin with pride at another woman's lie. The shame burned so deep she could hardly breathe. To the crowd, Daniel looked complete. To Grace, he looked like a stranger. She whispered words no one heard, her voice cracked by tears. He had denied his own blood and did not even know it. Her hand drifted to her stomach, not as a dramatic gesture, but as an instinct to protect the life he had just erased in front of the world. Cameras flashed, people clapped, and Daniel never once looked her way. Grace turned from the lights, her face blurred by tears, each step carrying her further from the man she had loved. The noise behind her was deafening, but inside she heard only silence. She walked out of the hall unseen, as if she had never mattered, carrying with her both the deepest heartbreak and the fragile spark of a child who would soon become her only reason to keep going. Grace left New York with nothing but a suitcase and the quiet determination to protect the life inside her. She settled into a crumbling apartment in Boston, where the walls leaked cold air in winter and the floors creaked under every step. Her days blurred into long shifts at a diner, her swollen feet aching as she carried plates to strangers who never saw her exhaustion. At night, she would walk home in the dark, her hand resting on her belly, as if to remind herself she was not alone. When it came time for doctors' visits, she sat in the waiting room surrounded by couples who held hands, whispering over ultrasound pictures. Grace sat alone, folding her appointment card again and again until the edges frayed. She wanted to believe she was strong enough, but each time the nurse called her name, the silence beside her felt louder than the heartbeat on the monitor. Still, when she heard that fragile sound, she would whisper promises that the child was wanted, that he was loved, and that she would never let him feel abandoned the way she did. Meanwhile, Daniel's life played out on magazine covers. The world saw smiling photographs of him and Clara stepping out of cars, dining at rooftop restaurants, waving to cameras as if happiness was theirs to spare. But behind the glossy images was a house stripped of warmth. Clara treated him not as a husband, but as an asset, a tool for her ambitions. She spoke of social circles and investments, rarely of love. At night, Daniel lay awake, the ceiling above him heavy with questions he dared not voice. The truth came like a blade. One evening, walking past Clara's study, he heard her laughter spill into the hall. She was on the phone, bragging about how easily she had staged the perfect trap, how a false pregnancy had secured her the Whitmore-Carter union. Daniel stopped in the doorway, his blood running cold. Every word from her mouth cut him open. His knees nearly buckled as the weight of realization hit. He confronted her, his voice sharp with fury, demanding to know if she had ever carried his child. Clara only smirked, tilting her glass of wine as if the whole thing was amusing. She told him he had been too blinded by vanity to notice. He had wanted the perfect picture, and she had given it to him. The cruelty of her words crushed him. For years he had built his life on that lie, and in doing so, he had destroyed the only truth that mattered. Daniel staggered back, his chest burning, his fists trembling. He saw himself reflected in the window, a man who had traded love for image, and the sight made him sick. He wanted to scream, to tear down the empire he had worshipped, but the silence of the house mocked him louder than any noise. Alone in his study, he pressed his hands against his face and whispered Grace's name. He realized that while she had carried his child in loneliness, he had carried nothing but pride and emptiness. 5 years passed, and Daniel Carter had only grown more powerful. His empire stretched across networks and newspapers. His name still lit up headlines as a man who could not be toppled. Yet when he returned home at night, silence pressed harder than any applause. Clara was long gone, their marriage dissolved in a storm of lawsuits and scandal, but Daniel felt no relief. His victories rang hollow. The echo of what he had lost haunted him far more than what he had gained. Every memory of Grace lived at the edge of his mind. He would close his eyes and see her face on the night she left, the way her hand pressed against her stomach before she turned away. That image replayed until it became unbearable. He began to wonder if he had missed the truth in that moment, if her silence had been more than heartbreak. Was she carrying his child when she walked out of his life? The thought consumed him, gnawed at him during board meetings, followed him into restless nights. He tried to bury it in work, but the harder he pushed, the emptier he felt. He looked at other families in restaurants, at fathers holding small hands on the sidewalk, and each sight cut deeper. He had traded what mattered for a reputation that now felt meaningless. His own reflection in the mirror became a stranger, a man polished on the outside but broken within. For the first time in years, he admitted he was afraid that somewhere a child bore his name without knowing it. Daniel began searching. At first he hired investigators, sending them into cities and small towns with photographs of Grace. But every lead turned cold. Then he went himself, traveling under false names, stopping at diners and bus stations, asking questions that earned him pity or suspicion. Each disappointment added another weight on his chest. The world was wide, and she could have vanished anywhere, yet he could not stop. He told himself it was businesslike persistence, but in truth it was desperation. Nights alone in hotel rooms, he would sit by the window and whisper into the dark that he was sorry. Sorry for not seeing her pain. Sorry for believing a lie over the woman who had loved him without condition. His words never reached her, yet he said them anyway, as if they could lighten the ache. What he did not know was that Grace was living only a few hundred miles away, raising a boy who looked more like him with each passing day. By the 5th year, Daniel no longer cared about the headlines that once defined him. He had money, influence, and an empire at his fingertips, but none of it could quiet the question echoing in his soul. Was there a child who carried his blood? If Grace had truly been pregnant that night, then he had not just lost a woman. He had abandoned a family before it even began. The fear of that truth left him hollow. But the faint chance of finding her kept him moving, one town at a time, chasing a ghost he could not let go. The search led Daniel to a quiet town in Maine, where a local fair was being held. He walked through the rows of booths, trying to blend into the crowd, when a familiar voice caught his ear. He turned his head and froze. Grace was standing only a few steps away, her hair pulled back, her laughter softer but still the same. Beside her stood a little boy, about 5 years old, with dark hair and piercing blue eyes that mirrored his own. Daniel's chest tightened, as if the world had stopped spinning. The boy held a balloon in one hand and Grace's fingers in the other, his smile innocent and unaware. Daniel whispered to himself that this was his son. He had imagined this possibility for years, but no amount of imagination could prepare him for the living proof in front of him. Grace noticed him a second later. Her face went pale, the color draining as though she had seen a ghost. She pulled Eli closer, her grip tight with fear. For one endless moment, their eyes locked across the crowd. Daniel saw the truth written in her expression. He saw both guilt and defiance, love and terror, all wrapped inside the woman he had lost. Eli looked up at Daniel with the open curiosity of a child. The boy tilted his head, studying the stranger who seemed to be staring only at him. His eyes, so achingly familiar, met Daniel's with a spark of recognition he could not explain. Daniel felt his throat close. He wanted to speak, to cry out, to kneel and reach for the child, but his legs would not move. Grace turned away quickly, whispering to Eli that they needed to go. She tried to sound calm, but her voice shook. Eli glanced back, puzzled, his balloon bobbing in the wind as he was pulled through the crowd. Daniel stood frozen, unable to follow, his heart pounding with disbelief and regret. The sound of the fair blurred around him, replaced by the thunder of realization in his head. The image of the boy's eyes carved itself into Daniel's soul. He finally knew what had haunted him for 5 years. Grace had not just left him, she had left with his child. Daniel felt the ground tilt beneath him. The truth that he had dreaded was now undeniable, and it shattered him in a way no scandal, no business loss, no betrayal ever had. Grace, meanwhile, walked quickly through the fairgrounds, her hand clutching Eli's as if to shield him from the man behind them. Her breath came fast, her thoughts spinning. She had built a life of silence, hiding the truth to protect her son. Now it had all cracked open in a single glance. Fear pressed heavy on her chest, not just fear of Daniel, but of the storm his presence would bring. Daniel stayed rooted where she had left him, his hands trembling, his voice breaking into the air. He whispered that the boy was his, that Grace had carried his blood away the night she disappeared. The words were swallowed by the noise of the fair, yet he knew the truth was louder than anything around him. His search was over. His son was real. Daniel's hand trembled as he knocked on the door, his chest pounding harder with every second. When Grace opened it, her face froze. The years between them collapsed into raw silence. She tried to shut the door, but he pressed forward, his voice cracking as he begged her not to walk away. Grace's eyes burned with fury. She told him he had no right to be here. Her words shook, but her stance was firm, like a wall built out of pain. The argument burst out of them before either could stop it. Grace's voice rose, accusing him of parading another woman while she carried his child alone. She stepped closer, her hands clenched, her body trembling with rage. Daniel fired back, his jaw tight, shouting that he had been deceived, that Clara's lies had poisoned everything. His words came fast, sharp, but they could not hide the cracks in his voice or the fear in his eyes. Grace's anger cut through him like glass. She told him it wasn't Clara who destroyed them, it was him. He had chosen image over love, reputation over family, and no lie could excuse that. Daniel's face contorted, his breath ragged, his eyes pleading, even as his fists curled helplessly at his sides. He reached toward her, then pulled back, as if even touching her now would be another betrayal. The room pulsed with silence, heavy with years of pain, until a small voice broke it apart. Eli shuffled in, rubbing his eyes, his pajamas hanging loose on his small frame. He looked up, confused, and asked why his mother was crying. The question sliced through both of them, their rage collapsing under the innocence in his eyes. Grace knelt quickly, gathering her son into her arms, her tears spilling onto his hair. Daniel's throat tightened, his chest breaking open at the sight of the boy, who was both the wound and the answer to everything he had lost. Daniel returned the next afternoon with a ball tucked under his arm, unsure if Grace would let him stay. Eli's eyes lit up the moment he saw it. Before Grace could protest, the boy was already tugging on his shoes, eager to play. Daniel followed him into the yard, his chest pounding with nerves. For a while they kicked the ball back and forth, Daniel stumbling and laughing when Eli darted past him. The sound of the boy's laughter filled the air, and for the first time Daniel felt a piece of the years he had lost being given back. After the game, Eli sat on the porch steps, with crayons scattered across the wooden boards. He leaned over his coloring book, tongue sticking out in concentration. Daniel sat nearby, unsure if he should say anything, until Eli turned the page to show him a drawing. It was a house, with 3 figures, a woman with long hair, a small child, and a tall figure with no face. Daniel's breath caught, tears welling in his eyes. His son had been sketching a father into existence, even when he had none. He asked gently who the figure was, though he already knew the answer. Eli shrugged and said maybe it was someone who might come one day. Daniel's hand went to his face, his shoulders shaking as tears fell. He pulled the boy close, overwhelmed by both joy and regret. Grace stood nearby, arms wrapped around herself, her heart tearing in two. Part of her wanted to walk away, to protect herself from the ache of trusting him again. But another part, aching, vulnerable, saw the way Daniel held their son and felt the dangerous pull of hope. Her mind screamed to remember the night he abandoned her, but her chest ached when she saw Eli lean against Daniel's shoulder as if he had always belonged there. She wanted to believe this man could be different, that he could stay, yet fear pressed down harder than longing. Grace turned her face away, hiding the tears that slipped free. Daniel kissed the top of Eli's head, whispering a promise the boy was too young to fully understand. Grace heard every word, and though her heart resisted, it began to crack open. It happened on a quiet afternoon. Eli was riding his small bicycle down the street, laughing with the careless joy only a child could carry. One wrong turn of the wheel sent him crashing onto the pavement, his little body tumbling hard. Grace's scream filled the air, and Daniel was already running, scooping the boy into his arms before he could even think. Blood streaked across Eli's forehead, and his cries pierced Daniel's chest like knives. The rush to the hospital was a blur. Daniel held Eli tight in the back seat, whispering promises that everything would be fine, even as his own voice shook. Grace gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, her heart breaking with fear. When they burst into the emergency room, doctors took Eli from Daniel's arms, and the sudden emptiness nearly dropped him to his knees. In the waiting room, Daniel paced like a man losing his mind. His expensive suit was stained with blood from his son's cut, but he did not care. He sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands, whispering to God to let the boy live. He said he would give away every cent, every company, every piece of power, if only Eli was safe. For the first time in his life, the empire he had built meant nothing. Grace sat across from him, her body tense, her eyes red. She had never seen him like this, stripped of control, raw with terror. Daniel reached for her hand, clutching it as if it were the only thing keeping him from falling apart. His words came out broken, saying that if Eli lived, he would never walk away again. He swore he would fight every day to prove he was not the man who had abandoned them. Grace felt the strength in his grip, the desperation behind his eyes. For the first time, she saw not the polished billionaire, but a father on his knees. The anger she had carried for years cracked just enough to let compassion slip through. She wanted to stay angry, to remind him of the pain he had caused, but her heart could not deny what she saw. He loved Eli with a force that shook him to pieces. Hours crawled by like years. Every time a nurse walked past, Daniel stood, his heart hammering. Finally, the doctor appeared with tired eyes but a calm voice. Eli would be fine. The wound was deep, but not life-threatening. He needed stitches and rest, but he was safe. Daniel collapsed back into the chair, tears spilling down his face in relief. Grace covered her mouth, her own sobs escaping at last. When they were allowed into the room, Daniel walked to the bedside and saw Eli asleep, his small face pale but peaceful. Daniel brushed a strand of hair from the boy's forehead, his hand trembling. He bent close and whispered that he was sorry, that he should have been there all along. Grace watched in silence, her heart breaking and softening at the same time. The truth was undeniable now. Daniel was a father, and the love he carried for Eli was real. Daniel's new life did not begin with grand gestures, but with small, stumbling steps. He moved into a modest rental near Grace's home, trading glass towers for peeling paint and creaky floors. Each morning he tried to walk Eli to school, his hand hovering until the boy finally slipped his tiny fingers into his. That touch felt like a victory greater than any deal he had ever signed. At home, Daniel attempted the simple routines he had never known. He burned pancakes until the smoke alarm shrieked, stood red-faced in the kitchen, while Eli laughed so hard milk spilled from his nose. Daniel wanted to hide, ashamed of his clumsy failure. But Eli threw his arms around him, saying it didn't matter because the pancakes were still fun. The boy's easy forgiveness pierced Daniel deeper than any wound. It showed him that fatherhood was not about perfection but about presence. Slowly, Daniel learned. He steadied Eli's bike on the uneven sidewalk, jogging behind until his legs ached, cheering even when the boy toppled over. He sat on the floor with crayons scattered around them, coloring clumsy lions and crooked stars. At night he read stories aloud, his voice breaking at first, then finding rhythm as Eli curled against his side. These small acts stitched themselves into something larger, proof that he was not giving up this time. Grace watched carefully, her heart caught between fear and tenderness. She saw him falter, blush at his mistakes, but come back again the next day with the same determination. She saw Eli's laughter grow louder, his smile brighter, every time Daniel was near. And though memories of betrayal still whispered in her mind, another voice began to stir inside her, soft but insistent, that maybe this man was learning how to stay. The night was still, the kind of quiet that made every word feel heavier. Daniel sat on the porch steps, his elbows on his knees, staring out at the empty street. Grace leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching him with guarded eyes. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Daniel lifted his head, his voice low and raw. He admitted that he had spent his whole life chasing the wrong things. He said he thought power would keep him safe, that reputation would make him whole, but all it had ever given him was loneliness. Grace listened without moving, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. Daniel's voice cracked as he said that the only real thing he ever had was her, and he had thrown it away. He confessed that every headline, every boardroom victory, every deal he signed meant nothing compared to the 5 years he lost with her and their son. His eyes were wet when he turned toward her, and in the dim porch light, she saw a man stripped bare of pride. Grace shook her head slowly, her arms tightening against her chest. She told him words were not enough. Words could not erase the nights she cried alone, the mornings she went to work sick and exhausted while carrying his child, the years she raised Eli without his presence. Her voice wavered, but her eyes stayed steady. She said he had vanished when she needed him most, and no apology could rewrite that truth. Daniel leaned forward, desperation etched in every line of his face. He did not argue. He only asked for a chance. Not forgiveness all at once, but a chance to prove himself, one day at a time. He said he would keep showing up, keep doing the small things, until she could see that he was not the man who abandoned her anymore. His words trembled, but they carried a kind of resolve that Grace had never heard from him before. The silence between them grew thick, the night air filled with crickets and the faint hum of the town. Grace felt her chest ache, torn between the bitterness she had carried for years and the longing that had never fully left. She wanted to believe him, but fear held her back. She turned her face away, unable to let him see how close her heart was to breaking. Daniel lowered his gaze to the ground, his hands clasped tightly together. He said he would wait as long as it took, that he was not asking her to forget the past, only to let him earn a future. His voice cracked as he admitted he had loved her all along, even when he was too blind to see it. Grace closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek, despite her effort to stay strong. The moment ended without a decision, leaving the question hanging in the night. The garden was strung with simple lights, and a small table overflowed with cupcakes instead of a grand cake. Children from Eli's school ran through the yard, their laughter filling the air. Grace moved among them with quiet grace, helping serve drinks and steadying balloons. Daniel stood back for a moment, letting the scene sink in. It was not the kind of party his wealth could easily buy, but it was the one that mattered most. Every detail had been chosen with Eli in mind, every moment a piece of the childhood he longed to give his son. When the time came to gather around, Eli sat in the center of the yard, a paper crown slightly crooked on his head. Daniel knelt beside him, his arm wrapped around the boy's shoulders. The guests quieted, expecting the usual cheerful words. Instead, Daniel cleared his throat and spoke with a voice that trembled but did not falter. He said that for most of his life he had measured his worth by headlines and contracts. He admitted that he had been wrong. The people leaned in, their faces lit by the soft glow of the setting. Sunday, Daniel's eyes found Grace's, and he said that his true fortune was standing right there in the yard. Not the company he once built, not the empire he once worshipped, but his son and the woman who had given him that gift. His voice broke as he promised that he would never again trade family for image. He told them that everything he had, every bit of strength, belonged to Grace and Eli. For a moment, the yard was silent, except for the rustle of the trees. Grace's eyes filled with tears. She walked toward him slowly, her hand trembling as she reached out. Without saying a word, she placed Daniel's hand into Eli's small palm, locking them together. It was not a promise of marriage or a declaration of forgiveness, but it was something even deeper. It was the acknowledgement that he belonged, that he was part of them now. Eli looked up at both of them, his smile wide and pure, not fully understanding the weight of the gesture but feeling the joy in it. Daniel pulled both of them into his arms, holding on as if the world would vanish if he let go. The crowd clapped softly, but their applause was distant compared to the sound of his son's laughter against his chest. The sun dipped lower, painting the garden in gold, wrapping the moment in a warmth that felt eternal. Grace leaned into the embrace, her cheek brushing Daniel's shoulder, her heart finally letting go of the fear she had carried for so long. The years of pain and mistrust could not be erased, but they no longer defined her future. In that moment, she chose to believe in what she saw before her. She chose healing. She chose love. The image of the three of them standing together in the fading light lingered like a photograph etched into memory. Daniel had once denied his own blood. Now he stood in front of friends and neighbors, declaring that nothing in the world mattered more. Mistakes had nearly destroyed them, but courage and love had built something stronger. And as the evening shadows stretched across the yard, the promise of a new beginning rose quietly in its place. From the moment Grace walked into that dazzling ballroom to the quiet garden where Daniel finally embraced fatherhood, this was a journey of heartbreak, regret, and healing. It reminds us that love is fragile, yet when chosen with courage, it can rebuild what seemed forever lost. Family is not measured by wealth or image, but by presence, sacrifice, and the willingness to stay. If this story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments and let me know what it stirred in your heart. Please subscribe, like, and share emotional echoes so more souls can feel these stories. Thanks for listening.